Hey, everybody. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The Stephen King collecting community is truly that, a community. I've met a lot of really great people. I've come in contact with a lot of great people online. I've been the recipient of many people's generosity in terms of their time and their expertise. That was one of my main reasons for starting this channel, was finding a way to pay forward the kindness that has been paid to me and to share the knowledge that I have gained both on my own and through the kindness of strangers over the years, some of whom have gone on to become my friends, whether or not I've actually met them in real life. But what I'm doing and is starting this subset of the channel, a series of videos that I will produce as the content is available, as people reach out and want to participate. But I'm calling these videos SK Collector Spotlights. So you're about to see the first one here in a few minutes. So if you are interested in being featured in one of these spotlight videos, just email me at skfirsteditions@gmail.com. I have some instructions that I can share. I have some Q&A questions that I would like you to answer, show your collection, kind of talk about your collecting journey, your favorite volumes, for whatever reason, whether they're the most valuable or they were the hardest to find or they were your best in the wild finds. These are the types of stories that I care about and that I feel like most people care about. I've talked at length before about the idea of rarity being relative, that it's not about the money, it's about the passion, it's about the love. So if you are very passionate about your collection, whether or not it's quote unquote impressive, if it means a lot to you and you've been collecting and reading Stephen King for years and you love Stephen King, if you're interested, email me at skfirsteditions@gmail.com. We'll go through all the details. But anyway, without further ado, onward and upward with the first SK Collector Spotlight.
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I am a Stephen King collector, as you may have guessed by my appearance on Mark's channel. And thank you very much, Mark, for allowing me to be on your channel today to showcase some of my collection. I hope I can do a good job and keep you guys entertained. So without further ado, let's take a look at the shelves. Alright, let's get started with the Dark Tower shelves up here. So this is my top shelf, and it is the crown jewel of my collection, which took me a very long time to put together. These are the Dark Tower signed limiteds, which I am the most proud of. So I have the 9 US signed limiteds up here, that being 1 through 7, Little Sisters and Wind Through the Keyhole. Mark and Noah have done a fantastic job of cataloging all this on Mark's channel. He has a bunch of other videos if you'd like to go check them out specifically. I have 2 of the 3 UK signed limiteds. The only 2 that are signed by King, being this Wizard in Glass here, and then the Wind Through the Keyhole over here. The third being the UK version of Charlie the Choo-Choo, which actually is not signed by King. I still need to pick one up, but it's a bit low priority for me, but I probably still should at some point. The only other one that I don't believe has been discussed on Mark's channel yet here is the signed limited Legends. So this was actually the first Little Sisters of Illyria signed limited. The Little Sisters of Illyria has an absolutely amazing edition that was done by Grant in, I believe it was 2009. This version is the first printing of Little Sisters of Illyria that actually came out in 1998, which is why it is between Wizard in Glass and Wolves of the Kala. We can go over that a bit more. This was produced by Tor and was also signed by some other of my favorites, being Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin. It has a bunch of signatures in there, but King's is also there. And it's pretty fantastic. Moving on to the second shelf of my Dark Tower case here, we have the Dark Tower series all in publication order. So starting all the way over here on the left is a very interesting piece. This is Men and Women by Robert Browning. This is the very first edition, 1855. And the reason this is on this shelf is because this contains the very first printing of Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which inspired the Dark Tower series. Moving on, we have the fantasy and science fiction magazines here, which each contain one of the 5 short stories that comprise the entire story of the Gunslinger. The first of these stories is actually called The Gunslinger, and that is actually printed here in The Year's Finest Fantasy Volume 2, which contains just this story right here, the short story of the Gunslinger. This was printed, I believe, in 1979 before the other 4 magazines were even out here, so pretty good there. And then we have just the standard first printing Gunslinger, drawing of the 3 wastelands, Wizard and Glass. Then we have the artist editions of 5 through 7. And we have Legends, which, as I mentioned above, is the first printing of Little Sisters of Illyria. If this was strictly publication, this would actually be between 4 and 5 over here. But I didn't want to split the cases up there. So then we have the artist edition of Little Sisters and Wind Through the Keyhole. Then we have Charlie the Choo-Choo over here. I have 3 of them, actually. This one here is from the Comic-Con, and I believe there are, oh geez, what was it? It's 150 or 200 of these. I don't remember off the top of my head, but this is quite a rare edition as well. It was signed by an actress that was hired to play Beryl Evans at Comic-Con. It was the actress Allison Davies, and that book has her signature in it as well. This second one here is the Anomaly edition of Charlie the Choo-Choo, and then the third one is just the standard edition. And I can crack those open and show them a bit later as well if you'd like. Moving on to the third shelf here, I have the Viking printings of 1 through 4, which they printed in preparation for Book 5 being released from Grant. And then I have the trade editions of 5 through 7 here as well. As you can see, these all have the keyhole graphic at the top, which is why they are all in the same space on my shelf here. And we have Wind Through the Keyhole by Scribner. And then over here, I have a few other printings. This is the second edition of Dark Tower, which was printed by Grant shortly after the first edition. This is an overflow because there were only 10,000 of the first one printed. And actually, 1,500 of them were printed incorrectly and misbound, which is a bit interesting. So they had to print some more to satisfy the demand. They have the third edition Gunslinger and the 5th edition by Scribner. And over here, this is actually the 4th edition that was printed by Viking. The Scribner version is actually quite recent, and then we have the 2nd edition of Drawing of the 3. So here on shelf number 4, we have the UK printings of the Dark Tower series. And as I believe was mentioned in Mark's other videos of identifying the first editions of the Dark Tower series, 1 through 3 was never printed in hardcover in the UK. So we just have the paperback sphere printings over here. Everything else is pretty standard until you get to here. This is the first printing of the Wind Through the Keyhole, and then this one is actually the W.H. Smith Collector's Edition of Wind Through the Keyhole. And aside from the sticker, which is not on all of these, you can tell the difference because the W.H. Smith edition has more flames. As you can see, there are just a few less flames on the first edition than there are on the collector's edition there. And the book next to them here is the facsimile edition of the Signed Limited. This has Stephen King's signature just printed on it. It wasn't actually signed by him, unlike the one up there, which is actually signed. But back down here, we have also here the German version of Song of Susanna. And the reason this one is on, I just knocked off the coaster there. The reason this one is on the shelf is because this was actually the true first printing of Song of Susanna, the German version. So there we go. So finally, down here on the 5th Dark Tower shelf, we have the signed limited version of the audiobooks. There is only Gunslinger and Drawing of the 3. They unfortunately never did any of the other audiobooks in signed limited form. And I have a bit of, excuse me, I have a bit of overflow here. There are the Marvel comics. And that is it for the 5th Dark Tower shelf. All right, on to the first printing shelves here. Everything is fairly standard. The only real quirk I have with my shelves is that If a book was printed in paperback form as the first printing, such as the Bachman books, and then later a hardcover version was released, I also have the hardcover version of that book in its place and order of publication, and we'll talk about that more when we come across them. So we just have the standard carry, 2 Salem slots because one is a second state and one's a third state, and then pretty standard stuff here. Oh yes, 2 Tommyknockers, and I have a couple duplicates. Usually if I have a duplicate, it's because there's a different jacket like the Salem's. Tommyknockers I have 2 because one is the red and one is the gold. And also one of these is the one with the full number line that says rights to come or something, and one's the number line without the rights to come. There, I have the 1990 uncut version of the stand where it goes there. Double Insomnia. And I have Omnis here. And here's something that's a bit, here's what I was talking about. Like I have the Green Mile serial editions because these were the original printings. And then over here, a bit later, I have the first Green Mile hardcover. Same with Storm of the Century. I have this extra talisman here just because it was printed with Black House. And on to the second case. All right, on to the second case here. We have the Dark Tower series to start us off, 5 through 7. And we have the Com Gordon pop-up book. Colorado Kid's actually an interesting one because for all the hard case crime books, we have the their first printing being just a normal mass market paperback that's just pretty standard, not really worth very much here. And then the Colorado Kid in particular is interesting because it has this one here, which is the large print edition produced by Random House. And this one is actually kind of rare. It is the only version of this book in hardcover that ever used the original art that the mass market edition used. And that is actually a bit hard to find compared to later in Joyland. But moving on, I do have all 3 Under the Dome editions here. This one's actually just the gift edition with the cards. I stuck it on my shelf in the first edition section because, you know, it just looked good next to them. There is the Cemetery edition, the Cemetery Dance printing of Blockade Billy, which does not have the short story in it, and it has a dust jacket. And the Scribner version, which does contain the short story Morality. Pretty standard stuff here. There's a little collector trinket. There's the, again, first printing of Joyland, just the mass market edition. And then a bit later, the illustrated edition of Joyland was released. And that is the first hardcover of that one. I have Gwendy's Magic Feather here in its order of publication, and I get away with this because the foreword was written by King. And that is how I performed those mental gymnastics necessary to put this on my shelf. Here's later in its hardcover edition. Double Gwendy's Final Task here, only because the bindings are different, and these are both true first bindings. One is the binding that was done to meet demands, and that's a bit of a lower quality one, and this one's the actual nice binding there. Same with Facing the Crowd. As you can tell, the books themselves did the same thing, 2 different bindings. They're actually identical here. Holly, and then way down here on this shelf we have You Like It Darker, which is the only book on this shelf so far, but hopefully there'll be more space taken here a bit later. And we're back up to the front-facing camera. So the first question is, what was the first Stephen King book that I ever read? And the answer was It. So when I was a child, a small child, at the age of 6, 7, 8, one of my favorite movies to watch, one of my comfort movies, in fact, was the 1990s miniseries with Tim Curry, and I loved it. I had the two tape VHS set back then, and I probably watched them to death. And then one day when I was around 11 or 12, I was out garage sailing with my mother, and I found a box of books, and within that book was It, of course. And having recognized that as the book, they went with one of my favorite movie series of all time. I know it's technically a mini-series, but I called it a movie back then. So I had her purchase me the book, and I read it, and reading that book at the age of 12 was a very interesting experience. I think it's an experience that you don't, you can't quite get the same experience reading it as an adult, which is what most people do. So question number 2 is, what was the book that made me into a constant reader? And the answer to this is probably just the Dark Tower series in general. So before I read the Dark Tower series, I had read a number of King's other books as well, and I enjoyed pretty much every one I had read up to that point. I enjoy most of his books in general right now, but reading the Dark Tower series and seeing all the connections, like noticing all the connections that I had known about and knowing that I was missing other connections, just made me determined to read his entire bibliography and get every scrap of Dark Tower knowledge I possibly could, see every connection, and that's really just what did it there. Dark Tower series is just fantastic. My favorite series of all time. Beats out everything else for me, personally. So what is my favorite Stephen King book? I actually have a top 2, and that is The Wastelands and Drawing of the Three, books 2 and 3 of the Dark Tower. These books are both fantastic, but even though they are right next to each other in series, and they're both Dark Tower books, they are very, very different than each other. They are very, very different from each other. Wastelands is more of a fantasy book, and Dark Tower 2 is... it's something crazy. It's a cocaine-fueled disaster / masterpiece, and Wastelands is just pure, perfect fantasy, tying the Dark Tower into The Stand and tying it into just everything else. They're both just fantastic books. And then my favorite book that is not a Dark Tower book, which I believe deserves an honorable mention here, is The Shining. I could go on and on about The Shining. One of the things people talk about most when they discuss The Shining is the differences between the book and the movie. And I like both. Of course, I love the book. I do like the movie as well. I know a lot of times people who really love the book hate the movie, and people who love the movie hate the book, etc., etc. They are quite different, though. The events are relatively the same in both, but it's how the events happen, what leads up to the events. Jack in the book is a much warmer character. He's a much more emotional character. The story itself is much more emotional. I believe King himself even said that the Shining book is like warm and the movie is cold and emotionless and brutal. And that is all true. It makes, in my opinion, for a good horror movie because it is, like I said, cold, raw, emotionless, except for the terror, of course. But it is very different in feel and in everything else than the book. It is a great movie, but a poor adaptation of the source material, I believe is the most accurate way to describe it there. All right, I'd kind of like to wrap 3 questions into one here. And the questions are, how long have I been collecting? And what prompted me to begin collecting? And what advice would I have for new collectors? And I think for these 3, I can wrap them all into one from my personal experience. So I've really only been able to collect books that are conventionally rare, like the ones behind me on my shelf, for about 6 or 7 years or so. But I've been really interested in like collecting and learning about it since about high school or so. And that's when I was collecting. I just started out collecting, just normal paperbacks because I really didn't have any kind of budget whatsoever. So I tried to first just collect every written form of Stephen King. If he published a book, I would try to find that book in some written form and put it on my shelf. And that was a really good goal. Just have everything, and then move up from there. I moved up from that to finding every edition in hardback, etc., etc. Finally, I was able to move up to what I have now. But I think even if you're a collector and you have a fairly low budget, you can always find something to collect, especially for Stephen King, that is very accessible, very entry level, and looks very nice. Like, for instance, the first edition Signet paperbacks. Like, if you have a full collection of those, everything Signet's ever put out, that looks really impressive on a shelf. It's an excellent collection, and you can You can do that even if your budget for buying books is only $5 or $10 a month. The most expensive one of those is probably Carrie or Salem's Lot. That maybe tops out at like $30 or $40. But I mean, you can have a fantastic Lincoln collection for not that much at all. So what is my main collecting goal? So when I really started to collect seriously, I had two main collecting goals. One I have accomplished, and the other I am about 99% of the way finished with. The first one was just to collect all of the first edition, first printings, which I have done now. The second goal was to collect all the Dark Tower signed limited editions and all the Dark Tower, basically just all the Dark Tower editions. And I'm about 99% of the way done with that one. The only one I'm really missing now that I consider to be missing for my collection is the Charlie the Choo-Choo signed limited, but that's just something I'll probably pick that up sometime in the near future. It's nothing too big. I just haven't found one for like a price I want to pay for it yet. So that puts me kind of at a crossroads in my collecting journey. And the next big thing I'm going to be working on, which will probably take me 20 or 30 years if I accomplish it at all, but that doesn't matter. The fun's all in the hunt, right? Is to try to get all these signed limited editions. And it'll probably take me quite a long time because I'm pretty strict with my book budget, so I'll only be able to probably obtain one every few months. But, that's something I'll be able to work toward and continue on with over the course of my career. So, what item in my collection am I most proud of and why? So I'm going to cheat a little bit here because I actually have two answers, but I'm only going to talk about one right now. And my answer is my Gunslinger Signed Limited. So this book has always been my grail ever since I was in high school. Ever since I learned about book collecting, my grail was the signed limited Gunslinger because I was a Dark Tower fanatic. It was quite far out of my means back then, and even when I had means to actually start collecting seriously, it was still kind of far out of my means. So what I ended up having to do was I collected every other Dark Tower signed limited, every other US signed limited, and I had two through the wind through the keyhole, and I ended up just liquidating all of them and purchasing the Gunslinger, just so I had it from the beginning, the hardest one to obtain, and then I built everything back up from there. And that is the story. That is about the only way I could have done it, but it was done, and I love this book. Again, this is my grail, my favorite one. So, do I have any amazing in the wild hunt stories? Yes, I do, and this also fulfills the second half of the last question, what am I the most proud of? This is the second one of those. It is my first edition Dark Tower Gunslinger, and this one I bought for $34.01, including tax. And it was the most amazing deal I'd ever seen in my entire life. The dust jacket on this thing is even fine or near fine condition. It's just amazing. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to send this off to Michael Whalen as well, and had it remarked by him. There's that remark page. And if you'll give me a moment, there's his signature with the Ka symbol, and Ka is a wheel. So this is probably, although the signed limited Gunslinger is, I love it. It's my grail. It's one of my favorite pieces of the collection. I think this is my actual number one favorite piece of my collection. And they just happen to both be Gunslinger. So, what is the number one item on my Stephen King wish list? So the only item that's actually on my wish list right at the moment is that Charlie the Choo-Choo signed limited. But that shouldn't really be too hard to get when I put my mind to it. So, if I could reach into the void and pull out one of any of Stephen King's items to just have in my collection, I suppose it would be a First State Salem's Lot jacket. Just because I find the history behind, the first, second, and third states of the Salem's Lot jackets to be very interesting. Although I am in the same camp as Noah Mitchell in that I think that the first state really shouldn't even count as a state. It should kind of count like as a prototype, because none of the first state jackets were actually ever on a book. None of them were ever released on a book. None of them were ever released to the public. They were just found in a filing cabinet sometime later. Only the second and third state jackets were actually available to the public at any time. So, yeah, there we go. So just in case, I wanted to record a little bit of supplemental material here. There are fantastic guides to identifying the first editions of all the Dark Tower books on Mark's channel already, and there are great guides about the Dark Tower Signed Limited books. But I wanted to go over Legends real quick, as I don't believe there is a Legends video on his channel quite yet. So, as I mentioned when it was on the shelf, this is a Tour Fantasy. And this is the short story collection that is the first printing of Little Sisters of Illyria. There's actually the little card that came with it here. And there is some fantastic art in this book. In fact, right there is the art for Little Sisters of Illyria. And here is the signature page here. It has Stephen King, Terry Pratchett, Terry Goodkind. A few others has George R. R. Martin, Robert Jordan. This one's particularly special for me because my three favorite series are the Dark Tower series, and then my second and third are A Song of Ice and Fire by George Martin and the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. So this was actually quite a big one for me. Let me see, where exactly in here is Little Sisters? There's The Hedge Knight by George Martin. Here we go. Nope. I think we're almost there. They're right here. So there we go. In fact, it looks like there's a little bit of a forward here as well. Yep. So only 4 of the Dark Tower books were published by this point. These novels, using thematic elements from Robert Browning's poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, tell the saga of Roland, last of the gunslingers, who embarks on a quest to find the Dark Tower, for reasons that the author has yet to reveal. Oh, pretty nice. So, speaking of Robert Browning's poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, I wanted to go ahead and open this one up here. This is Men and Women by Robert Browning. This is the first 1855 edition, the very first printing of that poem. So let's take a look at it here. So this is the actual book here, and it is quite fragile, having been being almost 200 years old now. So let me open it up here. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, page 134. 150. We passed it. Here we go. 133. Looks like it lied. It was actually on page 135, so the index is actually incorrect here. Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. See Edgar's song in Lear. My first thought was, he lied in every word. That hoary cripple with malicious eye, askance to watch the working of his lie. On mine and mouth scarce able to afford suppression of the glee that pursed and scored. Its edge at one more victim gained thereby. Pretty awesome. So, one more supplemental thing I wanted to go over real quick were the different versions of Charlie the Choo-Choo and why I had 3 on my shelf. So, this one is the Comic-Con version, and I did double check it. 150 of them were given out at Comic-Con. There might have been a few more floating around somewhere that maybe Stephen King gave out to people. But this is the Comic-Con one here. And if you'll notice, these are the Anomaly editions and the just standard first printing. These both have a quote right here. If I were ever to write a children's book, it would be just like this, Stephen King. However, the Comic-Con version is the only version that does not have that quote up here. And also, if we look at the back of them here, The Anomaly edition, which is the, aside from the Comic-Con version, was the first real printing of the book. It actually has a sticker on it. This is the Anomaly edition with a sticker UPC code, and this one is actually on the book itself. The standard first edition also has the Simon Schuster Books for Young Readers, and they both have this quote up here, whereas the Comic-Con version only has the art on the back with nothing else at all. And one more difference in the editions. Also, the Anomaly edition has, I believe there were 6,500 of these printed. It has the full number line here, 10 through 1, and the Simon Schuster version just has a mixed number line, so it's 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, you know, the numbers are mixed up there. But the sides are also different. The spines, rather. The Anomaly edition and the regular first edition both say Evans Dameron, Charlie the Choo-Choo, Simon Schuster. The font is different as well, actually, so that's another tell. You can tell the Anomaly edition apart from the regular first edition. The Comic-Con edition, however, only says Charlie the Choo-Choo, Beryl Evans, because they didn't want Simon Schuster on there. They didn't want. They did actually reference Dameron on the front cover, but they wanted it to be as close as possible to the real Charlie the Choo-Choo book from the Wastelands. But as you can see, they still did credit the wonderful Ned Dameron on the cover, however. Alright, so I also wanted to elaborate a little bit on the history of these magazines and the Year's Finest Fantasy Volume 2, and why those are on my shelf there. So, many people know about these magazines. These are the fantasy and science fiction set. The first one being from October 1978. Let's have a look at this one here. So this was the very first printing of anything Dark Tower related at all. And this was just the short story, The Gunslinger. And it comprises basically the first short story in the first edition of The Gunslinger here. So there are the contents, there are 5 different stories in The Gunslinger, and each of these, The Gunslinger, The Way Station, The Oracle in the Mountains, The Slow Mutants, and The Gunslinger and the Dark Man, which is renamed to The Gunslinger and the Man in Black, I believe, in the newer versions. Each one of those 5 is one of these 5 here. So, which brings us to this book here, The Year's Finest Fantasy, Volume 2. So why is this in the collection? The reason is because this book here contains the first hardcover printing of the Gunslinger short story, which is this one here. Stephen King is famous as the author of a string of best-selling fantasy novels, most recently, The Stand. So, by the time this was published, Stephen King had only published 5 novels under his own name, and 6 if you count Rage under Richard Bachman. Actually, he might have produced The Long Walk by this point, too. I'm not actually sure. It'd be 79. Anyway, it's probable, though, that he's never before written a story as unusual as this compelling novelette about 6 guns and sorcery. And then it goes on there. So, that is the story behind that. And I suppose that's about it for me. Thank you so much, Mark, for allowing me to be on your channel and to share my collection and my Stephen King passion with everybody else and with your viewers. I really hope you guys had a great time listening to me yammer on about my collection at length. Yep, thank you very much, guys. Have a great one.